Thank you very much. It's all very formal here nowadays. You've all gone up in the world. Used to be just a sandwich and a cup of tea round a wee circle. You're lucky. Thank you very much. And you need TV and all. I'm very delighted to be here again. I love coming here. I really do like coming here. Partly because it's Derry, but partly because it's Holywell, and I just think so much work has been done in this city by different groups of people that are now kind of working together in this place. And just even the imagery of having a place like this in the middle of town and such a great place as a central meeting point offers so many different issues. I was speaking to Joe there just very briefly before I came in, and we're talking about territory, and that actually human beings need a place to tell things. They don't just need to tell things, we tell things in places. And there's a whole big academic thing around place, what things look like in different places. And one of the problems with our history is lots of people have not ever been in each other's places. Partly because they feel that's what they're told not to go, and partly because then we internalise that very quickly. When I was in the Community Relations Council, you were always asked, what is sectarianism? And of course, and now in the Scottish Government we're asked, what is sectarianism? And first of all, when you're asked that question, it's very hard because it's something that happens between people. So you're trying to describe experiences, events, actions, behaviours, attitudes, thinking, and all sorts of things like that. So it's quite hard to define it. But at the very least, it's something that we grew up with in time. So in other words, we got it from a previous generation. It's legacy, as they talk about. In other words, if you change your relationship to these issues, you're also changing your relationship to your ancestors. So that's quite hard for people to change their relationship to their ancestors, no longer receiving the story just in trust as children do, but actually starting to question it. So that's tough work. And actually, I'm always really aware of that when you're teaching politics to people, is this matters to people. This is emotional. This is an emotional reality. This is not just an intellectual thing. You're asking people to revisit things that are about their deepest sense of who they are, their identity, as we talk about. And that word, I can always busk a wee bit about that, but the word identity, of course, is the same as identical. So when you change something about the story, you change something about me. So that is important. So it's about intergenerationality, but coming from one generation to the next, about our relationship to our ancestors, about our relationships to time, how we understand ourselves in time. It is about structures in the sense that it is about how we think about politics and how we think about big picture issues, countries, states, flags, all of that. It is about structures. It's about how things were done in this place around schools. It was how things were done about sport. It was how things were done about what games you played, who you talked to. It was structures, families even, who you married for a long time was very, very strongly defined by these kind of things. We talk about structures, but they're tracks. I suppose structure, another way of talking about structures is the tracks within which we live our lives. So the known tracks, what is known, is very much at risk whenever we're talking about these things. The third thing is, and possibly the thing which is most immediate, is behaviour. It actually changes what people do, where they go, what they say, who they'll say it to, what they wear, how they act when they're in certain spaces, whether they act at home or whether they act as somebody who's threatened. It affects the kind of things you tell your kids, what's safe to go and so on. So it is actually very much in not just the structures, the tracks, we keep it in the small decisions. The big decisions and the small decisions. And it's everything therefore to do with space. So we talk about time, you talk about public authorities and how things work, the tracks, you talk about space. And then you get this thing, it's attitudes. And attitudes, I suppose the attitude of something is actually the direction you look at something at. That's what the attitude of a building is. It looks to the south, it looks to the north. The attitude, it's where it's trying to say, what do you see? What do you see from here? And the reality of what we see is we see this. We don't see what's around us and behind us or in another place. The reality of human seeing is it's particular. And that's sometimes very, very important. the particular seeing. But sectarianism is a way of seeing in the middle of all of that. And it's unsurprising if everything you've inherited, everything that you understand the way the world works, everything that you then repeat because you tell your kids to not do it or you take in advance and so on. One of, I suppose, the example which comes to your mind, in my mind always, is the huge gap that exists in what people say they wish and what people actually do around housing. The Social Attitude Survey, one of these things which gets done every year repeatedly, has asked these questions over in time, and I was asked to look back over 20 years of it a couple of years ago, and 90% of people, when asked, would you like to live in shared living, say yes. And yet 90%, and it may not be that, but let's leave it at that, don't do it. Now, some of that might be habit, it might just be I'm more comfortable. But a lot of it has to do with I cannot make this choice in reality. That is a theoretical choice. It's in a dream world, in an ideal world, I would like to go there. In a real world, it's not something I can put my kids through. And where you choose to live is a decision about yourself, your family, and the people closest to you. You might be able to make that decision on your own. You might not get the choices, but it's usually the people who don't get the choices who end up having to bear the most difficult parts. And so it's not really surprising that it's often the poorest or the people who can move least who end up living sectarianism as an everyday reality. It's not really all that surprising. And I suppose that's where we're all part of it. Today, I suppose my question to myself when I was asked to come and talk about this was, this is a place where a lot of storytelling has been done over the years, and really, I think, not just storytelling, quite deliberative attempts to say, how do we give voice to what we know is there about what people have both done and experienced. And probably if anywhere has majored on that, it's been the Junction and the Holywell and PRG and all of these groups in Derry. So even with it, and possibly it's why this building's here, it's because there needs to be somewhere in this town which holds all of that together. And it's been important to be in the centre of the city as well. And I think we have to ask a few questions. When I left the Community Relations Council, I did a bit of work looking back over all the work that was done. And one of the things that becomes really clear is it is not true that huge innovation was not done in Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland. And even in that word we come to our difficulties. But it is not true, and we're in Derry and Londonderry, but please, if I make it wrong, just assume sectarianism and move on. You can correct me later. It's a good bet. But what becomes clear is, in fact, it's the opposite. Vast amounts of projects were undertaken here, some of which were better or worse, of course. Not all projects were good projects. But the innovation inside many projects was huge. Furthermore, over a 20-year period, you can see massive growth both in terms of the size and scale of the number of people involved, but even more importantly, where work can be done, who's involved in that work, what the issues they're actually addressing are, what kind of organisations can come out of it, what kind of programmes can come out of it. So by the end, you're talking about not just prisoners' work and victims' work, but also local community projects which are across big interfaces. You're talking about issues in workplaces, you're talking about churches talking forever, you're talking about joint initiatives of all sorts of different things between trade unions and so on. The list goes on, plus mediation and all sorts of skills development and things like that. There's lots and lots of it. And the really big question we have to ask ourselves is, we still resist it as the big picture, the scaling up question, as somebody said. How does this scale up? Because as we hit the cuts, the really big question, I suppose, is without the money, does any of this survive? Does any of this survive? Now, I personally am quite sanguine about that. I think the answer is yes, in fact, because I think in spite of ourselves, we have probably changed our positions in relation to each other quite a lot. Certainly, if you look at stories of the 50s and 60s in how this place worked, it's simply unthinkable that it would work that way again, that you would have committees made up of only one part of the community, that decisions would be taken about major public projects which did not take into account the implications across a wider community, that we think of our networks as entirely confined to one community or the other. Very few people in community action or in public office or even in business think of that as true anymore. So in spite of ourselves, we have probably built networks and relationships which matter. And there are still things which very clearly kind of block us. One of the, I suppose for me, I speak for myself, most obvious realities is that the whole peace process, if that's the right word, and maybe I can talk a little bit about that at the end, that we have now has taken on more of a feel of wading through concrete and less of a feel of vision and hope and possibility. And part of the question is the transfer of the experience from people, if you like, from human communities up into how we then reorganise ourselves as a result. So I suppose it goes back to that original point, which is the peace process at some level or other is easily understood in terms of humanity, but it's when it meets our intergenerational stories, our relationship to time. It's when it meets our structures and what it means for our safety and whether we're prepared to dismantle those things. It's when it meets, are we prepared to do things a little differently here? It's when it meets, we need to start seeing things from a different space and talking to each other, that it becomes hard. And the translation of those things is, I suppose, the next stage now, because it's not exceptional anymore. It is part of where we have to go. And I suppose that is my question, is how do we take what was learnt here? Some of the things which have become almost normal. The truth is, hearing stories, people in this place probably telling stories about their own experience, what was done to them, what was done by them, what was done, how they share those with each other, what happens, it's become part of a practice here. And I think incredibly helpfully a part of a practice. And my question to myself is, well, where do we go now? What happens now? And this is only speculative and entirely busky off the top of my head, so it's for thinking about. But I want to put that on the table, is where do we just hold it for a while and let that be and let it take its own time, or what are the next considerations? I suppose I was coming up on the car, and on Radio 4 there was a programme about the 80th anniversary of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it is the 80th anniversary of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the writer, A.L. Kennedy, was talking just about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she said that the actual secret was when they discovered that one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic released them both. That it was the recognition that there was something important about being with other people who you recognised and who recognised you, who got it. That was extremely important. That something human happened which released people and gave people a degree of additional support. Now, they made clear this isn't for everybody, but they also made clear that for a lot of people this has been hugely helpful, because it's given people another space within which to do things, and that unlocking of the human in the middle of it was extremely important to the existence of Alcoholics Anonymous. And they don't keep records of who's a member, I didn't realise that, but they have at least 2 million people now involved across the world in different groups. And there's something to me in that story which seemed to be important here, which is how do we unlock that human bit in the whole thing? There's a Jewish philosopher, and his name is Emmanuel Levinas, and he says this. He says, lots of structures treat people as if what he calls they are total. In other words, they're complete. People are just people. There's just me, there's just you. Actually, he says, we're not total. You don't just talk about a thing. We are potentially, even though we don't look at it, infinite. In other words, when we meet each other, the infinite possibilities in you meet the infinite possibilities in me, and we don't know where we're going. And the difference between being total and being infinite is infinite means you can change. There's possibilities, there's always possibilities, but the possibilities have to be unlocked by us meeting each other. And the possibilities of people meeting each other, and how does human meeting happen? And how does that transform relationships? Because it's in that meeting and in that recognition and in that acknowledgement, he says we're captured, we don't go back. You can't go back. Once you have entered into the infinity of the other and the other has entered into yours, you can't quite go back. That's part of it. And so our relationships are mobile. And that seemed to me to be really, really important idea to work with, which is that relationships really, really matter. And one of the reasons why politics spends so much time trying to control things is because we know that. Not they, we know that. We know that the ordering of things makes a difference to what happens. And so part of this is where do we make the possibility of recognition? And once we do that, how do we, I suppose the question for me is, how do we learn to make that our habit? That we kind of expect to be surprised, that surprise is part of the package. And maybe that's one of the big learnings of a place like this, is we've learned that surprise is possible. That things happen which you didn't expect when people meet each other. And people aren't quite what they look. They become also with each other in the meeting. And that is very, very important. And that atmosphere where people meet each other is extremely important. We know now, I think, a few things about truth-telling. And they're not exactly rocket science. The first one is there are truths we want to tell. There are truths we want to tell. Silences which haven't been given voice and which are important. Usually about suffering, about injustice, about pain, about fear, things which need to be given voice which haven't been given voice. But where that is at least a feeling of release. It gives an openness to the other and brings something back into the reality which has to be dealt with in the relationship. But we know that those are important. And at some level or other, that's acknowledged. We also like stories of heroism, of triumph against adversity. We like it when it's about going beyond what was asked, of rescue, of sacrifice, all of these things. We like to tell those stories. Those stories make us feel possibility. They give us possibilities of understanding that there is out of our suffering there is a response. But those are stories that are nice stories. And there are stories in some senses or other of us being, if you like, innocent, of our responsibility being to do the good. There are, however, inconvenient truths that we don't want to hear. And I suppose it's that pattern, watching that pattern, which is maybe where the learning is. Because, and I'm really not, while it is unbelievably important that we do tell these stories of triumph and we do tell these stories of suffering. And so I almost need to emphasize this, what I'm going to say next is we need to watch that we don't become addicted to telling those stories. Because those stories become a palliative as well to us, in which we only see ourselves in these stories. They almost counteract what we know. And so there's a serious danger if we get stuck there, that they're not a journey into a new possibility, but they're a journey into another fixed point in which we'd like to fix ourselves as this story only. But there are really some serious stories we don't want to hear. We do not, as we can tell now, I think, really feel comfortable when we hear stories of violence inflicted, of cruelty that we didn't either know or don't want to hear about, of causing fear or terror in others, of killing. We do not want to know that. We don't want to know really about hatred that we've felt, of our own bitterness, of our incitement, of our responsibility, actually, where up to now we haven't thought about it. And perhaps most about our helplessness in circumstances, about our collusion with circumstances because there was no other choice, about our ambivalence, the fact that we are profoundly ambivalent about some of this stuff, where some senses have been very relieved that somebody came in and did violence to somebody else because it gave us possibilities. And I suppose part of what we have to do now is ask the question, which is, how do we do two things at once? How do we give room for people to talk absolutely about their experiences of suffering and their experiences of heroism? That's absolutely clear. And we talk about what it does to us when it causes ambivalence and helplessness. And one of the most important things that this organisation, this group of people we together probably have been privileged to be at, is in circumstances where that ambivalence was held, where the stories were in themselves stories of suffering and heroism, and they were also complicated and difficult and had consequences. Because the truth we also know is that these things are joined up if we let them be. They have a tendency to join up. If we don't, one of the reasons I think we tell stories only to our own and only in our own space, we were talking again with Joe about them being territorialised or having them organised, is that the story is told and it doesn't have an ambivalent outcome. It doesn't have, it leaves us with something which at least gets rid for a while. But as I say, that in itself is slightly addictive because it doesn't really get rid of it. Because what we know now, I think, is in complicated ways and not in simple ways, these things are joined up. These things we keep separate are joined up. So, suffering is connected somewhere to violence and oppression. There's always a story on the other side of it. Injustice is connected to cruelty. Bereavement is connected to killing. Heroism is connected to violence. Collusion, helplessness and ambivalence in relation to this was an experience we all had, not quite knowing what to do with the situation we were caught in. And the not being heroic, but being helpless. I remember listening to police officers. I remember a really fascinating situation. It was about apology. And this policeman talking about how in the early days of the troubles, the conflict, whatever you want to call it, 1970s, being tipped off that there was an arms cache somewhere in West Belfast. It was Twimbrook, and they went up. But in order not to expose the tip-off, they had to search 10 houses, not one. The consequence, of course, being that 10 people in the middle of the night are brought out, disrupted, their houses destroyed, violent people coming in through the door, and all of that experience in helplessness. And the police officer saying, I regret it, but I can't apologise, because if I apologise, I pretend there was an alternative, and there wasn't for me. Now, I'm not here to defend or not that story. I'm simply here to talk about some the caughtness of people in circumstances that, who knows, I have no idea what happened to those 10 families. Whether even one or two or three, it was a tipping point in their experience that this wasn't just a personal matter, this was a systemic, sectarian, ruthless police service which was out to attack them in their areas, because it's clear that 10 people are done and they do it, and they're probably frightened, and they probably do it with huge violence, and they probably do it with it won't be, here's a parking ticket. It'll be, get out of here, and bright lights. And I don't know how many people went into that, but the ambivalence, and I don't know how many people who watched their children going in to do something were then ambivalent and said, I regret it, but I can't apologise. And so there's some huge gap between regret and apology going on here. What we keep asking for apology, we keep giving regret. And somehow or other we're not talking to each other about what's the gap between those words. How in any way do we take responsibility when we don't think there was any choice, but how do we avoid responsibility when in fact we did things happened which had huge consequences. And the truth of that connectedness, as we have to talk about now in public, is it is for me an established fact. These things are connected. That we can trace cause back from you did that to me to I did that to you because somebody like you did that to me. We can trace cause back now, which actually in a circle means what I did to you therefore resulted in something that happened to me. In a circle, we find ourselves in the terrible and awful, awe-inspiring situation that our reaction was somebody else's action. And furthermore, that we end up contributing to the destruction of our own communities. In a circle, that's the inevitable logical consequence. So that's hard. That circularity of the relationship is hidden unless we watch it played out in front of us. I have to say, I suppose, my experience in community relations, I've done it now for so long that it is taken for granted in my mind. It is just a fact. I've got to the stage now where that the real problem with telling the truth is that we will start wanting to tell linear stories and we'll end up having to acknowledge circular stories. And that means that the value of the catharsis of telling the story will be compromised by the having to hear what comes back. Now, our tradition is, of course, whataboutery. Our tradition is that we know this anyway at a deep level. But we do it here historically as a way to ensure that we don't hear each other, that we don't have to take your part seriously, that we can return the causality back to where it belongs, which is you're the cause and I'm the effect. But I suspect that the story from here is more ambivalent. And it's even more ambivalent yet because responsibilities aren't equal either. They're also unequally unequal. So it becomes an incredibly human, complicated, difficult process of harm and hurt and suffering and heroism and all of these different things tied together. And they belong somewhere in a story which is very difficult to tell because politics, like territory, has been created to join up the stories we needed to tell. They're linear. Our politics are linear. Our politics are essentially stories which say, this is how you should understand your story in terms of cause and effect. What is heroism? What is crime? What is suffering? What is regret? What is apology? I need apology from you. I need regret from me. But at every point, the human story and the impossibility of resolving it is, in this way, is very, very difficult. So the battle over telling the story really matters because every possibility that the story becomes circular is a risk in a linear political environment. And every story that asks us to put the humanity of it first risks being the first chink in the armour, because we actually have to say the humanity of the story matters more than the political narrative of the story. And once you do that, once you're captured by that, politics has a problem. Politics has a problem. So, the battle over telling the story has become, in some ways, the battle of modern politics. How do we give each other room to explore regret and apology? How do we give each other room to acknowledge what we already know, which is that these things are joined up? How do we explore responsibility in the middle of all of this without destroying the relationship we need to make a future as well? Because the paradox of the peace process is the very people who we want to get an apology from are the very people we depend on for future. That's what makes the peace process so difficult, and it's so exciting as well, is that it is a process in which the people from whom we demand apology are the very people for whom we depend on a future. And so the discussion around the past and the discussion around what happens seems to matter. I suppose, I could talk for a long time just about Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, and talk about the history of this, but I think I will leave it because it would go on too long. I just want to say a couple of things before I finish, because and then have a chance for some questions. I suppose the peace process in some ways and the Good Friday Agreement was actually an incredible experience. It's very unusual in conflicts where people have been at each other's throats that you get an opportunity to try to even make peace with the very same people that you've been at their throats with. So fact is that if you look at this as a political scientist, this is unusual. We got another chance. And we're not talking about two-state solutions. We're talking about a solution somewhere or other in which we live together. And that's interesting. That's actually interesting. So it's huge. We got a massive amount of international investment, and we got huge imagination, actually, on it. If you read the document, it's worth reading it. The Good Friday Agreement is a very, very good document. There's lots of really interesting parts in it around, honest commitment to reconciliation, that the best thing we can do in relation to the past is build a better future, that that we can be British, Irish and both as we may choose in perpetuity. Nobody's ever going to tell you ever again what your nationality is going to be, and you can change tomorrow if you like. That's what it actually says in the wording. It is globally unique, by the way. It's globally unique that one state, and it's a mutual thing, one state says to the other, your citizens will be my citizens. It's actually what the Good Friday. Every Irish person is an Irish if they wish to be, but they are fully to be treated fully as equal citizens in this country forever, and vice versa. If the border changes, British people are allowed to be British, and they will be treated as Irish forever. That's what it says, and that is, and you can be both, and you can change. So it's up to you. But we have solved the nationality problem. There isn't intellectually a better way or a more generous way to solve it. And yet we still have an issue. Profound issue around the past. So it is, and the issue isn't in the intellectual superstructure or the vision. The issue is in the risk of meeting each other and how we will cope with the ambivalence on the other side, and how we will cope when the structures and the intergenerational stories and the behaviours have to change. That's where the risk in the peace process is. And so the vision is out there. The international people are out there. What we did do was we said, we'll not speak about the past, which in one level or other was good because it was about suspending accusation. It was about suspending accusation. But at the next part, it was disastrous because in fact what it was about suppressing accusation. It was about trying to forget, never having to forgive. It was about trying to pretend that it didn't happen rather than giving ourselves room to deal with that somewhere later. So to be honest with you, what then history becomes afterwards, if you don't watch out, is just a battle to protect innocence. That each side is, in my sense, ultimately in this society, a losing battle to defend innocence. But if we don't want people to defend innocence, we have to also offer people, what are we going to do with the discovery of that we were guilty too? What are we going to do with that? How is politics going to deal with that? And what way are we going to begin to cope with that? Peace process can be, and so in many ways, the difficulty with that is that the peace process becomes characterised as loss. People say, we had to give in, we had to go with those people we should never have had to go into government with, we had to go into government with them. It was a terrible defeat. as opposed to finally we have the opportunity to do something different, and finally we have the opportunity to work with each other in a different type of a way. Now, the peace process is one of those two things. It's either a straitjacket which forces you to work with those bastards, or it is the possibility to do something different. But it's lost one way, and when people say about win-win, the win-win is that we finally have the possibility to work with each other, and it includes within it that we accept that that loss is worth it, that working with you is my possibility, not my risk. The second part is, of course, that we see the injustice of the past as an insuperable obstacle. What they have done to us is simply insuperable. Or we say, the possibility of peace is our possibility to talk about justice and to make justice even thinkably possible against this terrible backdrop of injustice. What we can't do is unpick 400 and 800 years of history. What we can do is say, that was then, now let's do something entirely different. That's what we can do. And then that, of course, includes looking at what has to be restored. But it is nevertheless that justice is in front of us, not behind us, in exactly the same way as peace is. And unless we understand that, these become actually the millstones around our neck. The very words which are meant to be the possibility become the millstones around our neck. So it strikes me then that the issue of dealing with this ambivalence of how do we get structure around being able to cope with this is going to be the really big test. That's how we move forward here. I suppose I want to say this. I want to say that we are not alone in this. Every society, and in fact Ireland, in a strange kind of a way, we're incredibly lucky. We are incredibly lucky people. We're sitting here now, we're in nice surroundings, we are, in the end of the day, most of us able to make our livings and move on, and of course there are difficult times ahead, but let me tell you, there are other places. I'm reading a book, I just read a book by a woman called Sophie Oksanen, and it's called Purge. She's Finnish, but her relatives were Estonian. And Estonia, for those of you who don't know, is a small country, but the same size as us, 1.8 million people, right on the edge of Russia. And it is now in the European Union. Since the Soviet Union collapsed, it joined the European Union after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it is about the story of that place. In the last 75 years, since 1940. After the World War, they only became independent. It was a tiny country. They were basically serfs, but they spoke their own language, and they became independent in 1918, 1920, exactly the same time as us. The Irish independence and partition all happened exactly the same time. So the same age as us and the same size as us, and they're on the other side of Europe. And in 1940, as part of the war, Hitler and Stalin made a pact. And where Hitler moved into the west, Stalin moved into the east. And he took over all of those countries. And lots of people, Estonians, I suppose there's 150 million Russians and 1.8 million Estonians, and it's flat. So it's not like Switzerland where you have to fight up hills. You can just come in. So they come in. And they take over, and these people resist. And a year later, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. And and this is hard for me to hear, lots of those people see that as a relief. That Hitler's come to take Stalin. No, Stalin's not great, Hitler's not great. But some of them go to Finland and go away, but some of the most heroic people join in and become part of the Nazis. Unfortunately for them, Stalin came back in 1944. And Stalin took a huge revenge. 1/3 of the Estonian male population was sent to Siberia. Large numbers of Russians were imported into Estonia. Speaking Estonian didn't bother at all learning this silly language, this silly farmer language, and they all they continued to speak Russian and were given privileges. Lots of people had no other way to live except to collude with the new regime. It was there forever, and nobody got very far if they didn't. And they were tortured, and they were raped, and there was a large amount of killing. So you have a history of the Nazis, you have a history of the Soviet Union, you have a history of purge. This is all in the last 75 years. This is all within living memory, these people. They're all sent back. After Stalin dies, some of them come back, and the people who've been making their way with Stalin can't cope with the people who've been purged, and there's huge problems there too. So they have a problem of who colluded with who was sent away, how do they reconnect. They have a problem with the Russians, who are now a third of their population living in their midst, and in 1991 they become independent. And the question is, there's all sorts of things then. First of all, the West arriving isn't necessarily great if you get controlled in a sex trade by the Russian mafia. It's the arrival of massive capitalism. But beyond that, it's also the reckoning. Are these Russian citizens? Should they be sent home? How do we deal with the history of what we did and what they did? How do we deal with the fact that they might come back anytime? So now with the Ukraine starting, if you're living in Estonia, it looks like they might come back. And you have no idea. It's only 25 years ago since you got your independence. You have no idea. The only reason I'm telling you that story is because this story of how we find our way out of our history, how we deal with the injustices, how we deal with the ambivalences is incredibly important for lots of places. And we have an opportunity to deal with it in a way which may be actually better, and we need to take it. Because one of our historic issues is not that we're the most important conflict, but that we had so much opportunity and we need to take it. We need to take it. That's what I always think about Ireland is we need to take it. Because if we don't take it, nobody else can take it. And the issue therefore is, what have we got to do? Well, I suppose I would like to think about how do we take steps with what is going to happen here, which is ambivalence, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity. How are we preparing ourselves for that? How do we manage the risk for people? That is, if you step in acknowledging the moral ambiguity, you will not yourself be destroyed. How do we ask permission that this risk is permitted? That political authorities, if not at least embracing it, at least permit it. That they give us the space to take this room. Because I think that's really, really important now. That we understand, those of us who've been there know, that what we are going to is a world of ambiguity, risk, uncertainty, ambivalence, as our gateway to making a new possibility which is built on a different future. As the only possibility, otherwise we have to be silent. Otherwise we have to be silent, because that's where it's going to take us. That's what we know from our experience here. And I suppose the question therefore is story, not just storytelling, but story hearing. How do we pay attention to the context in which stories might be heard, not just stories might be told? Because that is the entry into the infinity, into the eyes of the other that captures you, how it's heard. I suppose it is about what is around us when what it creates is not a new certainty, but a dawning realization that things are more complicated than that. How do we deal with the next bit, which is, and where do we find our responsibilities in that, which is the third bit. So three phases. How do we get the story heard? How do we manage the ambivalence that it results? And how do we talk about taking responsibility? And those three things seem to me now, if we're serious about moving beyond storytelling as just talk, but actually realizing we are in possession of what is, in political terms, and I don't like this language, but I'll use it anyway, an incendiary bomb. Because the incendiary bomb is, the stories are circular, not linear. that we are connected in our innocence and our guilt. That doesn't mean that it's simple or easy or that everybody's guilty. I don't want a simple solution like that. It means, however, that as we go forward, we will have to deal with our ambivalence and the complexity of this, and that we need to be somehow prepared, because that's what we know already from everybody who sat around these tables. And so maybe our job is to begin saying, you can't do this, no one, because for some people this is too hard. It will create a reaction. It'll create anger. It'll create a reaction to silence it. It will have an equal knob, because it will be seen as an attack on people. if this is done as an attack on people rather than as a gateway into a better future, people will react and say, you're trying to take away the one thing that keeps me safe. So somewhere around creating what is safe space, how does this also incubate a tolerance, not just about getting stuck in the ambivalence, but and now where do we go? So it has to have a story about the future, as well as a story about the past, and a story about ambivalence, and a story about responsibility. It has to be for something. It's because this is the best way for us to go forward. And that actually is what we have to face. And the resistance, I think, is not that we don't know it now, it's that we are scared of its consequences. And managing the consequences of truth for some of us is probably an important task now. How would we think about that together? And maybe we have to talk to each other, those people who've gone through some of these storytelling sessions and felt that, about what that looks like. What are the things which have to be put in place to make this a better place to go rather than a worse place to go? How do we, and that, some of that's of course personal counselling, some of it is actually different from that. It's how do we think about what that changes in terms of structure, in terms of the stories we tell, and in terms of what we do and where we look at things from, how we look at things from. And I think arts are very important here. I think spaces, using physical spaces, are important here. I think faith groups have huge opportunities here to talk about it from there. I think they can be visual. I think they can be verbal. And maybe, and this goes back to the old Catholic tradition, maybe we have to have something which looks like a modern form of what used to be called confession, but is actually called the Sacrament of Reconciliation, which is about contrition and restoration. How do you, what does it look like to acknowledge, neither regret or apologise, acknowledge what happened in the past and its costs, and to prioritise on the back of that restoration? And what does that look like? And I pretty much feel that some of that is ritual, some of that is engaging people in events, in opportunities, in places and times where that becomes a reality and isn't done in a cosmetic way, but is actually a genuine sense of it. What I am absolutely sure of is, and I'll finish with this now, is that this is really, really quite important now, because the obstacle to the future at the moment is the past. The reason we can't trust each other into the future is because we don't trust each other in the past. And so breaking that connection seems to me to be quite an important task now. And one of the reasons, and I remember, and I'll finish with this, listening to a guy who said to me, you know, if you lose your capacity to act out your anger by lashing out at somebody, but you can't forgive it, then the consequence is you internalise it and it eats you up rather than you eat it up. And the danger of this society is that's where we're actually going, not to violence, although you'll get some of that, not to the possibility of moving on, but actually to a kind of very sullen, very almost depressive self-eating. And if I was to characterise where we're getting to in our politics, I think that's where we're getting to. It's that we don't know how to move from these. We know one thing's not possible, which is going back to violence. We know one thing is impossible, which is forgiving it. And so the consequence for us is, it's not that it goes away, it just sits there eating us up like a kind of a cancer, with the danger that the opportunities that we have are limited. So I sat on the Sentence Review Commission, and it's funny to sat in that, and then of course I'm sitting in Derry where Bloody Sunday is a reality very deeply in the city. And between those two, the paradox is that what's definitely not true is everybody's story's been told, but what has been true is I can tell you a shape is already visible. The Bloody Sunday story is of what security looks like when it turns into paratroopers trying to control a crowd. It looks like 13 people dead and the entire city traumatised for years, decades, possibly forever. The Sentence Review Commission looks like the disintegration of cause, actually. It's all out there because it's all in the public domain, so this is all judicial records. These were the people who were, we looked at all the people who were convicted, so we had all their records. So at the margin, what this looks like is a man who was drunk eating pizza on a bench, and some other lads come out of a bar and they decide he's a Fenian, and they throw him into the river and he drowns. Actually, he's so drunk his nose goes under the water and he drowns, and they get status as that's loyal. On the other hand, it looks like people in Fermanagh, and they can't get over this, it's very clear they can't get over this, who were doing their jobs, they had jobs but they were part-time UDR, and he had his job in the lorry driver, and he was moving stuff up and down, quarry stuff, and they watched him from Clonus all the way up to Lisnaskea, through everywhere, and there was watch people on everything, and they eventually watched his pattern and shot him dead. And for all the people, and then I'm releasing this person, and for all of his relatives, the whole community was against us. They were all watching us. They were all watching us. And that is also a deep trauma left in this community, and that was what republicanism looks like to people who are living on the border. It's somebody going in after somebody, brushing past the mother with the child in her arms to hit the guy over the head with the police block. That's what it looks like. Now, I think that the circularity of these stories is an important dimension which we have to hold in the middle of this. And I think that we need to be honest about this, that is actually what the big risk is. And I also think it is also a great possibility, which is how do we meet each other, not simply asking for between apology and regret, but in acknowledgement and change. Thank you.
Duncan Morrow for president. Thank you, Duncan. I'm sure there's questions. Anybody any questions?
Hi.
Have you had the opportunity to present this talk to politicians and church leaders en masse?
Nope.
I think you should.
You get to the junction to do these things. In fact, I didn't know what I was quite going to say until this morning. But it is very much in my. I'm absolutely sure that people like me who've had the privilege of having been at all these things need to start saying these things, which makes it very unpopular, but it is true. There's an unpopularity as well there's an unpopularity with the obvious, if you like, which is those who are very clearly linear. There's an unpopularity with those who have the story, which is we were the good people and only the bad people did the killing as well. So there's two levels of re-engagement with belonging which are difficult here. So this is not. There is obviously, a nationalist and unionist story, if you like, which are destroyed. But there's also a story about we were the good people who were out of it, and they were the bad people who were in it, which is challenged by this a lot because collusion and ambivalence and bitterness, passing on bitterness and hatred, are unbelievably difficult to tie down in law. They're impossible to tie down in law. It's one of the things which constantly makes it incredibly difficult. Law, of course, has to act at the point where the event happens. So it's the person who's specifically responsible for the event. And it is less interested, and probably necessarily so, in what's the backstory. It's more interested in you did it. Okay? However, if you see sectarianism as intergenerationalism, if you see it as in being taken to a certain place, if it is about the bitterness and the anger about the structures which were real and was your experience, if it is about our participation in complexity, then exactly where responsibility for this lies is much, much, much more widely spread. Much more widely spread. And actually, some, not all, some of the moving away from interfaces was about being able to be bitter without having to face the consequences. And that is still incubated then where we are far away from it, but we hold it. So that is, this, sometimes people then accuse you of, oh, you're just letting them off. No, actually not. It is, because I'm under no doubt, reading all those sentence review things did not make me become banal about it. It made me actually, but it made me aware of what you might call the banality of evil. In other words, that it was small things people did. It was that lookout thing where everybody's just passing on a tiny little piece of information. You went at 1:15. It is, now did they kill him? No, but it is more complicated. Finally, maybe to say is, and I suppose I see, because of that experience, and it's kind of course, because I spent a lot of time on it, it quite shaped me, and unusually, because I was the only, funny enough, locally born Protestant on that process. Everybody else was either imported in from Britain or South Africa, or England or South Africa, and they were local nationalists, I suppose. But I was the only locally born Protestant on that, possibly, I think, because I was the only one who was willing to do it. but because a lot of concern as in the Protestant community about that whole process of letting people out. But what becomes really, really clear when you read that is that people who pin their hopes on justice, on the judicial process, I actually want to say, I wish it was possible, and it is absolutely not possible to do justice. Let me tell you why. Because actually those murders, this is what people don't really understand, turned out to be not just the person who pulled the trigger, the person who ordered it, 3 people running the car, 3 people in the lookouts, the ones who disposed of the clothes, the ones who passed it on to the next place, the lookouts, all of this. And the only people we got were the ones who were mostly younger and a bit more stupid, who left their DNA on the place, or who. But the chain of responsibility for these things is enormous. It's enormous. It passes out. So when people say, I want my day in court and I want the person who did it done, I always want to go, well, I hope you know who the person who did it was. Because the person who did it, I'm afraid to tell you, wasn't a single individual. It was, this is the box. And for one murder, if we were to get everybody, we'd have to put 20 away. Now that's going to be a complicated operation. So I want to say, in sheer practicality terms, in sheer honest to God terms, I understand exactly what you want, that somebody says to you they did it, and that you know, and that they are responsible because they have no idea of the devastation they caused in your life. I totally understand it. And with all honesty, I have to tell you, I wish that justice could be done, but I have to tell you, the justice system isn't going to tell you this, but in honesty, they cannot deliver what you wish. Which is somebody saying to you, it shouldn't have happened to my loved one, and I should not have had to go through this agony. And that is just true. And we as a community need to somehow find a space to say that to people. You should not have had to. And you were, in some level or other, even where they were targeted, random victims, because there were a lot of other people who could have been done and equally done as well, and didn't. So the people who suffered for all of us in a deep sense. And in that sense, I believe we're collectively responsible for the lot. So we need to take real responsibility for this together and stop trying to wash our hands of that responsibility and just take it, get on with it. Personally.
Anybody else before we wrap up?
Duncan, you see in sectarian terms, I know we're out of time here, but
Sorry, it's you.
you see there's a whole lot of organisations, if we talk about Scotland because it'd be easier, maybe in Scotland, a whole lot of organisations which are clearly sectarian, and whether or not they choose to, their supporters, their followers, perpetuate sectarianism in sport, like Celtic and Rangers. You hear people singing the Soldier Song in Inverness, and Celtic go 2-0. It's crazy. Or singing the Broad Black Bloomer. What has this got to do with anything? Or the Orange Order, or the Apprentice Boys, whatever it may be. These are organisations which willingly, knowingly, or otherwise are sectarian and support sectarianism intergenerationally, should they be banned?
The simple answer, I suppose I would start with no and then work back. Rather than waffle and then come to no. I'll start with no and work back. First of all, the banning is a complicated thing because the person doing the banning needs to be clean themselves, and and banning, once you ban, people say that's just because you wanted to ban our stuff. Historically, in Derry, the big dispute that caused the Battle of the Bogside was what marches should be banned, and they decided to ban political and not traditional ones, funny enough. So bans are complicated things, right? So that's why I think you have to be very, very careful. There may be some things you have to ban, by the way, so because we don't have an alternative, because simply the consequences are too big. Number 2, Scotland. Interesting. Tomorrow, according to the opinion polls, the Scottish National Party is going to sweep the board, right? Well, I went to see Rangers versus Celtic in their first match in 3 years in January for the first time. And if it wasn't horrific, it would be hysterical. I mean, it is the most organised hatred you have ever seen in your life. Pure, naked, organised hatred. The Scottish government, the Scottish police have now, and we have it too, they have mobile interfaces. They have interfaces which can now be erected at a short notice and pulled down. So it was incredibly well managed. It cost millions and millions of pounds, and they were on the route. And it was a Hampden, so it was 50-50, right? The Scottish National Party is about to win all of the votes, and there wasn't a Scottish flag in that stadium. It was Union Jacks at one end, it was tricolours at the other end. It was at the going down of the Hun, we will remember you, on the one side, and it was we are not abused on the other side. That is what we did. It was the Soldier's Song at one end, it was Rule Britannia at the other end, it was John Knox and his, who it's good to be a Roman Catholic at one end, it was the Billy Boys at the other end. It was the lot. There is something in that which is interesting in Scotland, because at another level in Scotland, the overwhelming consensus is this needs to be consigned to the past. We're not interested in this anymore. It's not specific, and it's out of, it's funny, it's not mostly anymore in things like jobs or even in marriage. There's a very high intermarriage rate and so on going on. But what's interesting in Scotland is that here it became commercialised, frankly, in my view. There's a real risk, which is that Scottish football depends on it, actually. If you did realise that if they didn't have this, what would there be in Scottish football? So, I come back to this, which is, part of this is not about banning, it's about substituting, it's about recontextualising, it's about giving something else to do, it's about giving it a different context. The best thing that probably could happen to Scottish football is if they were ever allowed, paradoxically it won't happen if they create a separate country, but is that they get into the Premiership, because they would have a lot of games to play, and it would dilute it, and it would cease it. It would still remain, no doubt, but it would remain something, it would become something a little bit less absolute and so total in that sense. I think that sectarianism has mostly to really go, has to be discovered and recognised rather than simply told. There are very, very few people who put up their hand and call themselves, I am a sectarian. We haven't got to that yet. We probably, in the way that people do about race, funny enough, people are happy enough to talk about racism, they identify people. There are very few people, and it's so deep, it's so old, this one, that we don't do it. So my answer to you is this, is sectarianism is not just these organisations, they're part of the structures for me which have come from it and relate to it. My question in the peace process is that what the peace process has told us is that the combination of trying to dominate people and sectarian religious hostility read across then into economics and violence is catastrophic. So we're now having to work back the other way, which is let's now go back to the organisations we have and say, what do we do in the light of this insight that this has to stop, that we have to find a different way. Now, whether some of those need to be banned, my instinct is that a lot of this can change. You know, historically, you know, being a Cavalier and a Roundhead doesn't matter anymore. Eventually you can get this to the point where it is part of who you are, but it doesn't mean that you're out to attack people. But I do believe, certainly, that pretending that it doesn't matter and that it doesn't have consequences is something we now can't go on with, and that we have to drive into our political public world very clearly, is that this is not a harm-free activity. This is an activity in which we are talking every day to the people who are picking up the consequences, and we know that this can go from being small-scale rhetoric into being real lives destroyed and to another generation. And so for me, in blunt terms, I think probably banning is what you have to do only when you've tried everything else. But I think that means we have to try everything else. Just sitting there letting it fester is also not going to work. All right.
Can I just mention, as a point of information, by the way, and it's relevant to what Eamon is saying, a friend of mine worked at in the stewarding operation in Dublin. It might have been last close season, Eamon. May have been the year before, but there was a tournament which had Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Republic all playing.
Yeah.
And he was amazed because he was talking to Scottish football fans who supported Celtic and Rangers back home, who were party to giving dogs abuse to the Northern Ireland fans because they sang God Save the Queen as their anthem. The Scottish guys, of whatever colour, were all singing Flower of Scotland, you know. So they vented their spleen on the Northern Ireland fans for, you know, feather chicken or whatever, you know.
There's
So there's hopefulness in it.
You know something, I must say, I think there is hopefulness in that Scotland stuff. I think the truth is Ulster Scots has been about one direction of the connection. The connection in this city is actually the other way. It's for Irish people who went to, in Donegal particularly, is of people who went to Glasgow. Glasgow's packed out with Donegal people. And there's something about the reconnection of that in a real sense that these borders, whichever way we draw them, will not tell the human story of this community, and that politics has to begin to learn to cope in the modern era, not with politics as we'd like it in a linear sense, but with much more of a complicated story which takes us over borders whichever way we draw them. If we draw it to include one part and exclude another, inevitably we'll have to deal with this, and this is something we have to learn now at the core of what we do. And I know people don't find that ambivalence difficult. We have the rise of UKIP, we have the rise of everything else going on all over Europe, and nevertheless it's an important task at a human level for us to get on with it. All right? Thank you.